Hello, it's week 29 of season 7 of the Andy Griffith Show. This week's episode title is Opie's Most Unforgettable Character. Opie's teacher assigns an essay to write over the weekend. She says write 500 words on your most unforgettable character. And Aunt Dee and Opie's talk trying to get in some ideas. They say, why don't you write it out to Eggman, Mr. Driscoll, or Gooder, or Howard. And then after Andy goes to his lodge knitting, Aunt Dee says, why don't you write it out your father? And Opie likes the idea. So he goes and observes his pa at work the next day, and he asks him questions about his work. But there's no law enforcement excitement going on that day. The most exciting thing going on was Andy's checkers game with Goober. So Opie gets disappointed about that, and he comes home and tells his Aunt Bee about it. And she says, try to find out about the way your father thinks. Delve into his philosophical side. That's what's most unforgettable about Andy. So when Andy comes home from work, Opie asks him what his philosophy of life is. And Andy says, I'm all for it. And then Andy goes in the kitchen, and he asks Aunt Dee why Opie is asking all these questions. And Aunt Dee says, don't tell Opie I told you, but Opie chose you as his most unforgettable character. And Andy is honored. And then he goes out to the living room to have a talk with Opie. And he tells Opie he's been thinking about that philosophy question. He says his philosophy of life is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And Opie writes that down. And then Andy says, I'm going to go take a bath now, and I might think of some more philosophy while I'm up there. And so Opie writes his essay. And the next Monday, Howard congratulates Andy because Aunt Dee had told him that Andy's the subject of Opie's essay. And Gooder thinks it's great too. And then they see Opie riding his bike home from school, so they call him over and they ask him how it went with the essay. And Opie says he got an F. And then he rides away. So Andy goes over to the school to see Helen and to try to get some information about Opie's F. She says it wasn't because of Opie's grammar or vocabulary or sentence structure, and it certainly wasn't because of his choice of topic. She just says it wasn't very interesting. Yeah, she says she's sure that Opie will write some more interesting things in his rewrite that he can turn in for a better grade. So that night, Andy visits Opie in his bedroom and asks him how the rewrite's going. And Opie says pretty well. And Andy sees Opie's piggy bank sitting there, which used to be Andy's, and he tells him a story about the first dollar he put in it. It was $1 he got paid by the county for catching a wildcat with his bare hands. But then Aunt Dee comes in and she says, oh yeah, that was that cat. It was so sick he could barely stand up. So later Andy tells Opie and Arnold about the wobble ball pitch he used to have when he played baseball in high school, and the no-hit game he pitched against Mount Pilot. And then Gooder comes up and says, yeah, it was a no-hitter because Andy walked 17 men and they lost 10-0. So Opie goes back to his rewrite and he has trouble. He keeps on starting and balling it up and throwing it away and restarting, but then he gets an idea. And the next day he tells his pa and Gooder and Howard that he got an A on this rewrite. Then he wrote about Arnold's dad this time, Dr. Daly. And Arnold wrote about Andy, and he got an A too. And Opie tells his dad off to the side that when he wrote down unforgettable things about his own pa, it sounded silly. And Andy looks Opie in the eye, and he says he understands. And that night Aunt Bee says to Andy, aren't you interested in what Arnold wrote about you in his essay, Andy? And Andy says, no, not at all. But then when Aunt Dee leaves and Arnold and Opie come in, Andy sends Opie out on an errand and he invites Arnold in the kitchen for a glass of milk. We'll see you next week for episode 30, which will be the last episode of season 7.